Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. February in the Cascades seemed like a good idea when I planned it from my apartment in Seattle. My sister had just gotten engaged. My job at the insurance company was draining every ounce of energy I had, and turning 34 in a cubicle felt like a slow death. I needed to prove something to myself, I guess, that I could still do hard things, that I was more than spreadsheets and conference calls. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the weekend, and I had hiked Snow Peak Trail twice before during summer months. 6 miles in, 6 miles out. Nothing I could not handle. I packed my gear on Friday night, told my roommate Alicia I would be back Sunday evening, and left before dawn on Saturday morning. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived, which should have been my first warning. But I just thought I was lucky to have the mountain to myself. The first 3 miles were exactly what I needed. Cold air burning my lungs, the crunch of packed snow under my boots, and absolute silence except for the occasional bird. Pine trees lined both sides of the trail like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with white powder. I stopped around 10 in the morning to eat a granola bar and check my phone. No signal, but I had downloaded the offline trail map. Everything looked perfect. The sky was that impossible shade of winter blue, so bright it almost hurt to look at. I remember thinking this was the clearest my head had felt in months, maybe years. I took a few photos, adjusted my backpack straps, and kept moving. By 11, I noticed the first clouds gathering on the western ridge. They looked far away, nothing urgent. I kept hiking. That was my second mistake, and the one that nearly cost me my life. The storm came faster than anything I had ever experienced. One moment I was walking under scattered clouds, and 40 minutes later, the sky turned the color of wet concrete. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my exposed cheeks went from cold to numb in what felt like seconds. I stopped to pull on my balaclava and extra gloves, fumbling with the zipper on my pack as the first snowflakes started falling. They were not the gentle, floating kind you see in holiday movies. These came down hard and fast, driven sideways by a wind that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within 15 minutes, I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The trail markers, those little orange flags tied to branches that had been guiding me all morning, disappeared into a wall of white. I pulled out my phone to check the offline map, but my fingers were already stiff inside my gloves, and the screen kept registering phantom touches from the moisture. I managed to get my bearings. I was about 4 miles from the trailhead, maybe 4.5. I needed to turn back immediately. Turning back sounds simple when you say it like that. But when visibility drops to almost nothing and every direction looks identical, simple becomes impossible. The trail I had been following was gone, buried under fresh snow that was accumulating faster than I could process. I tried to retrace my footprints, but they were filling in behind me, softening into vague depressions that could have been anything. Rocks, roots, animal tracks. The wind made it hard to think. It was not just cold, it was loud. A constant roaring in my ears that drowned out everything else. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, telling myself that as long as I kept moving downhill, I would eventually reach the road. That is basic mountain survival. Water flows down, trails follow water, roads follow trails. I just had to stay calm and keep moving. But after 20 minutes of walking, the ground started sloping upward again. I had gone the wrong way. I was heading deeper into the wilderness, not out of it. And that is when I looked down and noticed the footprints. At first, my brain tried to make sense of them in a logical way. I thought maybe I had walked in a circle without realizing it, that these were my own tracks from minutes earlier. But the prints were too fresh, the edges too crisp, and they were not behind me, they were beside me. A second set of boot prints running parallel to mine, maybe 3 feet to my left. I stopped walking and stared at them. The snow was coming down so heavy that any tracks should have been half buried within minutes, but these looked like they had just been made. I turned around slowly, scanning the white void behind me. Nothing. Just snow and trees and that horrible howling wind. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and my voice sounded small and swallowed by the storm. No response. I looked back at the footprints. They were slightly larger than mine. The tread pattern different. Deeper grooves, a blockier heel. Someone else was out here with me. Someone who had been walking right next to me without making a sound. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive so far, tried to offer explanations. Maybe another hiker had gotten caught in the storm too. Maybe they were lost like me and had spotted my tracks and decided to follow them. That would be smart, actually. 2 people have a better chance of surviving than 1. But if that were true, why had they not called out to me? Why had they stayed just out of sight, matching my pace? Close enough to leave prints beside mine, but never close enough to see. I started walking again, faster this time, and I made myself look down every few steps. The prints kept appearing. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Perfectly parallel to mine. Whoever this was, they were not falling behind or pulling ahead. They were staying exactly even with me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I tested it once, paused mid-step with my right foot still raised, and I swear I heard the faintest crunch in the snow to my left, like someone else had frozen in the same position. Then nothing, just the wind. I lowered my foot and kept going, and the prints continued beside me as if they had never stopped. I do not know how long I walked like that. Time stops making sense when you are cold enough and scared enough. It could have been 30 minutes or 2 hours. The snow kept falling, the wind kept screaming, and those prints kept appearing beside mine with mechanical precision. At some point I realized they were not just parallel anymore. They were angling inward, slowly, degree by degree, guiding my path to the left. I had not noticed it happening, but when I stopped to check my phone again, the compass showed I was now heading northwest instead of south, deeper into the backcountry, further from the road. Whoever was out there was not just following me, they were herding me. I felt a surge of anger cut through the fear, hot and sudden. I was not going to die out here because some sick person wanted to play games. I forced myself to stop walking and think. The wind was coming from the west, which meant if I kept it on my right cheek, I would be heading south. Simple. I adjusted my direction and started moving again, deliberately ignoring the footprints now. I would not look at them. I would not let them guide me anywhere. But the prints changed too. They were no longer beside me. They were in front of me now, cutting across my path at a diagonal, forcing me to either step over them or veer left to avoid them. Every time I corrected my course, new prints appeared ahead, blocking me, redirecting me. It was like trying to walk through a maze that was being built around me in real time. I stopped again, and this time I screamed into the storm, a raw, wordless sound that tore at my throat. I demanded that whoever was out there show themselves. I called them a coward. I said things I'm not proud of, desperate things, begging things. The wind swallowed every word. And then, for just a second, the snow thinned enough that I could see maybe 50 feet ahead. There was a shape standing between 2 pine trees. A person. Tall, wearing dark clothing, completely motionless. I could not make out a face, just the outline of a body, a hood pulled up, arms hanging at their sides. We stood there looking at each other, or at least I think we did. And then the snow thickened again and they were gone. Something broke inside me after that. Not courage, I do not think I had any left by then, but the paralysis that had been building in my chest. Seeing them, actually seeing a real human shape standing there watching me, made it concrete. This was not my imagination. This was not hypothermia playing tricks on my brain. Someone was out here with me, and they did not want to help. They wanted something else. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small canister of bear spray I always carried on hikes. It was not much, but it was something. I held it in my right hand with my thumb on the trigger and started walking again, this time moving as fast as I could without running. Running in deep snow is almost impossible anyway, and I needed to conserve energy. My legs burned. My lungs ached. I kept the wind on my right cheek like a lifeline and refused to look at the ground anymore. I did not want to see the prints. I did not want to know how close they were getting. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, counting my steps to keep from screaming. I had counted to somewhere around 300 when the trees opened up and I nearly walked off the edge of a ravine. I caught myself at the last second, grabbing a branch that scraped through my glove and tore the skin underneath. Below me was a drop of maybe 40 feet, rocky and steep, with a frozen creek at the bottom glinting dully through the snow. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I looked to my left, then to my right, trying to find a way around. The ravine stretched in both directions as far as I could see, which was not far, but far enough to know I could not just walk around it quickly. This was where they had been guiding me. This was the dead end. I spun around, expecting to see that dark figure emerging from the white, but there was nothing behind me except snow and silence. The footprints were there, though, a whole trail of them leading right up to where I stood, stopping maybe 10 feet away from me. Fresh, crisp, patient. Whoever this was, they had brought me here on purpose, and now they were waiting to see what I would do. I made a decision in that moment that probably saved my life. Instead of panicking, instead of trying to run along the edge of the ravine where the snow was deep and the footing was uncertain, I did the last thing they would expect. I went down. There was a section to my right where the slope was less steep, more of a sharp incline than a sheer drop, with exposed rocks and roots poking through the snow. I shoved the bear spray back in my pocket, turned around so I was facing the slope, and started climbing down backward, gripping whatever I could find. The rocks were slick with ice and my gloves made it hard to get a good hold. Twice my foot slipped and I slid several feet before catching myself, my jacket scraping against stone, my heart lodged somewhere in my throat. But I kept going. Halfway down I heard something above me. Not the wind, something sharper. A sound like boots crunching on snow, fast, moving toward the edge of the ravine. I did not look up. I just moved faster, my arms shaking from the effort, my fingers numb even inside my gloves. When I finally reached the bottom, I landed hard on the frozen creek and felt the ice crack beneath my boots, but it held. I scrambled to my feet and looked up at the top of the ravine. There was a figure standing at the edge, looking down at me. The snow had thinned just enough that I could see them clearly for the first time. A man, I think, based on the build. Broad shoulders, tall frame, that same dark hooded jacket. He was not moving, just standing there with his hands at his sides, watching me. I could not see his face beneath the hood, but I felt his eyes on me like a physical weight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he took one step back from the edge and disappeared into the white. I stood there shaking, waiting for him to reappear somewhere else, waiting for him to find another way down. But the minutes passed and nothing happened. The storm continued to rage above me, but down in the ravine, the wind was blocked by the walls, and for the first time in hours, I could hear myself think. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, still no signal, but the compass still worked, and I knew that creeks flow downhill, and downhill meant civilization. I started walking along the frozen water, following its winding path through the ravine, and I did not stop until the walls began to shrink and the trees started to thin, and I saw, in the distance, the gray line of a road cutting through the snow. A pickup truck found me stumbling along the shoulder about 20 minutes later. The driver was an older man named Earl who worked for the county road maintenance crew. He said I looked like a ghost when he pulled over, pale and shaking and barely able to form words. He wrapped me in a blanket from his truck bed and cranked the heat up as high as it would go while I sat in the passenger seat and cried. I tried to tell him what happened, about the footprints and the figure and the ravine, but I was shivering so hard that my teeth kept chattering and the words came out jumbled and broken. He just nodded and drove me straight to the ranger station at the base of the mountain. The rangers took my statement, gave me hot coffee, and called search and rescue. A team went up the next morning after the storm cleared. They found my tracks leading off the main trail, found where I had descended into the ravine, found the frozen creek I had followed to the road. But they did not find any other footprints. The snow had covered everything. Or maybe there was nothing to find. I do not know. The ranger who spoke to me afterward said it was possible I had experienced mild hypothermia, that the cold can cause hallucinations and paranoia and confusion. She said it in a gentle voice, like she was trying to be kind. I nodded and thanked her and did not argue. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know those prints were real because I watched them appear beside mine, step by step, for what felt like hours. I know that figure was real because I saw him standing at the edge of that ravine, watching me, waiting. I filed a police report when I got back to Seattle, and they said they would look into it, but nothing ever came of it. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspect. Just another strange incident in the backcountry that could not be explained. I never went back to Snow Peak Trail. I have not gone hiking alone since that day, and I do not think I ever will. Sometimes at night, when the wind picks up outside my apartment window, I still think about that figure in the storm. I think about what would have happened if I had not climbed down that ravine. I think about where he was trying to lead me, and what was waiting there if I had followed. And I think about this, that somewhere out there, maybe right now, he is standing in the trees at the edge of some empty trailhead, watching another car pull into the parking lot, watching another woman lace up her boots and check her phone and head off alone into the white, and she has no idea he is there. Night shifts at a 24-hour laundromat teach you things about people that daylight never reveals. What happened to me on a Thursday in February 2018 still makes me check the locks twice before settling behind the counter. I had been working at Sudsy's Coin Wash on Belmont Road in Columbus, Ohio, for about 8 months by then. A gig I picked up after dropping out of community college the spring before, when paying rent became more urgent than earning credits. The place was nothing special. 12 industrial washers, 8 dryers, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects, and a small office in the back where I spent most of my shift watching Netflix on my phone and occasionally helping customers with jammed machines. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most nights I saw maybe 4 or 5 people total. That Thursday, the weather forecast had warned about a polar vortex pushing temperatures down to -15 degrees, the kind of cold that kills homeless people and cracks car batteries in half. Around 2 in the morning, the laundromat was completely empty. The wind outside howled against the plate glass windows so hard I kept expecting them to shatter inward. I had just finished mopping the floor near the folding tables when I noticed a woman standing outside the front door, her face pressed close to the glass, her breath making little clouds of fog that disappeared almost instantly in the brutal air. She was wearing a thin jacket, not even close to appropriate for that weather, and no gloves. Her fingers were red, almost purple at the tips, and she was shivering so violently I could see her whole body trembling even through the door. She made eye contact with me and raised one hand in a weak wave, then pointed at the door handle. Company policy was clear. After midnight, the doors stayed locked and customers had to use the buzzer system. But looking at this woman, maybe in her late 40s with graying hair plastered to her forehead and desperation carved into every line of her face, I knew I could not leave her out there to freeze. I walked over and unlocked the door, and she practically fell inside, bringing a wave of frozen air with her that made me gasp. She thanked me in a voice that was barely a whisper, her words cracking like ice breaking on a pond. Her name was Renee, she said, and her car had broken down about a mile up the road. She had been walking, trying to find somewhere open, anywhere with heat. Her phone was dead. She held it up to show me the blank screen, and she just needed to warm up and call her brother to come pick her up. It all made perfect sense. I told her she could sit in one of the plastic chairs near the dryers, where the residual heat made that corner the warmest spot in the building. I even offered her the cup of coffee I had been nursing, which she accepted with trembling hands. Watching her wrap her fingers around that styrofoam cup, I felt good about my decision. This was basic human decency. You do not let someone die of hypothermia because of a company policy written by people who had probably never worked a night shift in their lives. For the next 20 minutes or so, things were calm. Renee sat quietly, sipping the coffee, slowly regaining color in her cheeks and fingers. She asked if she could use the phone in my office to call her brother, and I said of course, leading her to the back. The office was small, barely bigger than a closet with a metal desk, a rolling chair, a safe bolted to the floor where I deposited the coin collections, and a corded phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. She dialed a number, spoke briefly to someone. I could hear a male voice on the other end but could not make out the words, and then hung up. Her brother was on his way, she told me. Maybe 30 minutes out. She thanked me again, and I noticed that she was looking around the office as she spoke, her eyes moving slowly across the safe, the desk drawers, the small security monitor that showed grainy footage of the main floor. At the time, I thought nothing of it. She was probably just curious or bored or still disoriented from the cold. I walked her back to her chair by the dryers and returned to my spot behind the counter. About 15 minutes later, the buzzer rang. I looked up at the security monitor and saw a man standing outside, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. He was tall, probably 6'3" or 4", with a shaved head and a thick beard that had frost clinging to it. I assumed this was the brother, arriving faster than expected. I glanced over at Renee, and she was already standing up, walking toward the door. But something about the way she moved caught my attention. She did not seem surprised or relieved the way you would expect someone to be when their ride finally shows up after being stranded in deadly cold. Her pace was measured, almost casual, and she kept her eyes fixed on me rather than on the man outside. I pressed the button to unlock the door, and the man stepped inside, stamping his boots on the mat and blowing into his cupped hands. He nodded at me once, a quick jerk of his chin, but did not say thank you or offer any greeting. He walked straight past the counter and stood next to Renee near the dryers, and the two of them began speaking in voices too low for me to hear. I tried to go back to my phone, scrolling through social media without really seeing anything on the screen. But I could not focus. Something about the dynamic between these two people was making my chest tight, sending little prickles of unease down my spine. They were not acting like siblings. There was no hug, no expression of relief, no thank God you made it moment. They stood close together, almost shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent toward each other like conspirators. Every few seconds, one of them would glance in my direction, quick, furtive looks that they probably thought I did not notice. The man had not taken off his coat, had not sat down, had not done any of the things a person does when they arrive somewhere to wait. He was standing with his weight balanced on both feet, his posture rigid, like someone ready to move fast if needed. I started running through explanations in my head. Maybe they had a complicated relationship. Maybe he was angry about having to drive out in this weather. Maybe I was being paranoid because it was 3 a.m, and I had been alone for hours. But none of those explanations quieted the alarm bells that were now ringing steadily in the back of my mind. The man broke away from Renee and started walking toward me. His boots were heavy, work boots with steel toes, and each step echoed against the linoleum floor like a slow drum beat. He stopped on the other side of the counter, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke and something else underneath it, something sour like old sweat. Up close, I could see his eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they held no warmth whatsoever. He asked me if I had a bathroom he could use. I told him yes, pointing toward the short hallway that led to the restrooms near the back of the building. But he did not move in that direction. Instead, he leaned forward on the counter, his thick forearms pressing against the surface, and asked if the bathroom was near that office he had seen on his way in. I felt my throat tighten. The way he said it, That office, he's made it clear he had been paying attention, cataloging the layout of the building since the moment he walked through the door. I told him the bathroom was on the left, the office was on the right, and the office stayed locked. He smiled at that, a small curving of his lips that did not reach those dead gray eyes, and then finally turned and walked down the hallway. I watched him disappear around the corner, and immediately Renee appeared at the counter like she had been waiting for that exact moment. She leaned in close, closer than was comfortable, and I could see a small scar running through her left eyebrow that I had not noticed before. She asked me if I was here alone tonight. The question hit me like a bucket of ice water. I lied without hesitation, told her my manager was in the back doing inventory and would be out soon. Something flickered across her face, frustration maybe, or recalculation, and she glanced toward the hallway where the man had gone. She asked another question then, her voice still friendly but with an edge underneath it now, wanting to know what time my shift ended and if someone else would be coming in to relieve me. I told her 7, told her my coworker was always early, told her whatever lies I could think of to make this place seem less isolated than it actually was. She nodded slowly, processing this information, and then walked back toward the dryers without another word. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. These people were not here by accident. They were not stranded travelers waiting for a ride. They were here for something specific, and I was starting to understand exactly what that something was. The man came back from the hallway, but he did not return to where Renee was sitting. Instead, he walked directly to the office door and tried the handle. Just like that. No pretense, no excuse. He rattled it once, twice, then looked back at me with those flat gray eyes and asked if I could open it because he thought he left his phone in there when his sister made that call earlier. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I told him no, told him the office stayed locked and only the morning manager had the key. That was another lie. The key was in my pocket, had been there all night, but I delivered it with as much conviction as I could muster. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles bunching beneath his beard. Then he turned and walked back to Renee, and the two of them had another whispered conversation. I used that moment to pull out my phone, keeping it below the counter where they could not see it. My hands were unsteady as I typed, my fingers clumsy on the screen. I pulled up the number for the local police precinct. Not 911 because I did not know if this qualified as an emergency yet, but the non-emergency line I had saved months ago after a drunk customer threatened to break our windows. I kept my eyes on them while the phone rang, watching as the man walked back toward the office door. This time he did not bother with the handle. He planted his shoulder against the door and pushed, testing its strength, the wood groaning under the pressure. Renee was standing now too, positioned near the front entrance, and I realized with a sickening lurch that she was blocking my only way out. The phone clicked and a dispatcher answered, her voice bored and tired. I spoke as quietly as I could, told her my location, told her I had 2 people in the building who were trying to break into the back office, told her I was alone and scared. She asked me to stay on the line, told me officers were being dispatched, told me to stay calm and not to confront them. I almost laughed at that last part. Confrontation was the furthest thing from my mind. All I wanted was to survive the next however many minutes until help arrived. The man slammed his shoulder against the office door again, harder this time, and I heard the frame crack. Renee's head snapped toward the sound, then back to me, and our eyes met across the fluorescent-lit room. She knew I had made a call. She had to know. And the look on her face, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of the desperation she had performed so convincingly an hour ago, told me that the situation was about to change very fast. Renee said something sharp to the man, a single word I could not make out, and he stopped ramming the door. For a moment, everything was still. The buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant rattle of the wind against the windows, the muffled voice of the dispatcher still talking in my ear. All of it seemed to fade into the background as the two of them stood there, frozen in what looked like indecision. Then the man reached into his coat pocket, and my entire body went rigid with fear. But what he pulled out was not a weapon. It was a phone. He looked at the screen, said something to Renee, and she cursed loud enough for me to hear it clearly across the room. Sirens. Faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but growing louder with each passing second. The man shoved his phone back in his pocket and strode toward the front door, not running but moving with purpose, his boots hammering against the floor. Renee followed right behind him, pausing only to look back at me one last time. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration at being thwarted, just a kind of blank assessment, like she was filing my face away for future reference. Then she pushed through the door and disappeared into the frozen darkness outside. The police arrived about 3 minutes later, 2 cruisers with their lights painting the snow-covered parking lot in alternating blue and red. I let them in with hands that would not stop trembling, and I told them everything. They searched the area but found no trace of Renee or the man. No abandoned car a mile up the road like she had claimed. No footprints in the snow leading anywhere useful, the wind having already erased whatever trail they left behind. The officers took my statement, examined the damage to the office door. The frame was cracked nearly in half. One more good hit, and it would have given way completely, and told me I had done the right thing by calling when I did. One of them, a woman with short gray hair and a calm, steady voice, said this was not the first time they had seen something like this. Teams of 2, she explained. One to play the victim and gain entry, the other to show up later and do the heavy lifting. They target isolated businesses during extreme weather, counting on the cold to make people sympathetic and careless. She said I was lucky. She said it could have gone much worse. I knew she was right, but knowing it did not make the shaking stop, did not make the image of Renee's final look fade from my memory. I quit that job 2 weeks later. Gave my notice the very next morning when my manager arrived and saw the splintered door frame, the police report on the counter, and me sitting in the corner with a cold cup of coffee I had not touched in hours. He understood, told me he would have done the same. I found work at a warehouse after that, day shifts only, surrounded by co-workers and forklifts and noise, the kind of job where you are never truly alone. It has been 6 years now, and I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit. Every time the temperature drops below 0, every time I see a news report about the homeless dying in the cold, every time someone knocks on a door late at night, I am right back in that laundromat, watching Renee press her face against the glass with those purple fingers and that performance of desperation that fooled me completely. I do not blame myself for letting her in. I think most people would have done the same thing, faced with a freezing woman begging for help in the middle of the night. But I learned something that Thursday in February, something that has stayed with me ever since. Kindness can be a door, and there are people in this world who spend their lives looking for someone willing to open it. My commute home from the warehouse usually takes about 40 minutes, but that night in January 2023, it was closer to an hour because of the ice. I had just turned 34 a week before, and my wife kept telling me I needed to find a job closer to home, something that did not require driving through rural stretches of road at 11 at night. She was right, of course. She usually is. But the pay was good, and we had just bought our first house, so I kept making that drive 5 nights a week through back roads that barely got any county maintenance during winter. That particular Wednesday, the temperature had dropped to maybe 15 degrees, and my Ford's heater was fighting a losing battle against the cold, seeping through the windows. I remember being tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from loading trucks for 10 hours straight. All I wanted was to get home, kiss my wife, and collapse into bed. I was about 20 miles from home, driving through a stretch of road that cuts between old farmland and dense patches of woods, when I saw the figure on the shoulder. At first I thought it was a deer, the way the shape just appeared in my headlights. But then I saw arms waving, and I realized it was a person, a woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing a dark coat that was way too thin for that kind of weather. She was standing next to what looked like an old Chevy sedan, The hood popped open, and she was flagging me down with both hands like her life depended on it. Now, I grew up in a small town. My parents taught me to help people when they need it. And out here, on a road like this with no cell service and temperatures that could kill you in a couple hours, leaving someone stranded was not something I could do. So I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of her car and put my hazards on. I sat there for a second, watching her in my rearview mirror as she jogged toward my truck. Something in my gut tightened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. She came up to my passenger window and I rolled it down halfway. The cold hit my face immediately, sharp and biting. Up close, I could see she was younger than I first thought, maybe early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her nose was red from the cold, and she was shivering hard, her teeth actually chattering when she spoke. She told me her car had died about an hour ago, and she had been waiting for someone to pass by. Said her phone was dead and she needed a ride to her brother's place, which was just a few miles down the road. She pointed vaguely into the darkness ahead, past where my headlights reached. I asked her if she wanted me to take a look at her car first, maybe try to jump it, but she shook her head fast and said it was no use, that the engine had been giving her trouble for weeks and it finally gave out for good. The way she said it, quick and dismissive, made me pause, but she looked genuinely cold, genuinely desperate, and I could not just leave her out there. So I unlocked the door and told her to get in. She slid into the passenger seat and immediately put her hands up to the heating vents, rubbing them together. She smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour that I could not quite place. I asked her where exactly her brother lived, and she gave me directions that took us off the main road, onto a smaller one I had never used before. I knew the area well enough to know there were a few houses scattered out that way, old properties with long driveways hidden behind trees, so it did not seem impossible. But as I turned onto this narrower road, I noticed how the pavement got worse almost immediately. Patches of ice everywhere. No tire tracks ahead of us, no sign that anyone had driven through here recently. The woods closed in on both sides, branches hanging low and scraping against my truck as I drove. I slowed down to maybe 20 miles an hour because I could barely see where I was going. My headlights just got swallowed by the darkness ahead. And that was when she told me to keep going, that it was just a little further. Her voice had changed, not scared anymore, calm, almost flat. I glanced at her and she was not looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her hands no longer rubbing together for warmth, just resting on her thighs. The shivering had stopped too, which struck me as strange because the heater in my truck was not that good, and she had been freezing just minutes ago. I asked her how much further, trying to keep my voice casual, and she just said soon. That was it. Soon. No other details, no landmarks to watch for, nothing. My grip on the steering wheel got tighter. I started thinking about how far we had come from the main road. Maybe 2 miles, maybe more. I had not seen a single house, not a single light through the trees. Just darkness and ice and this woman sitting next to me, who suddenly did not seem like the same person I had picked up. I thought about my wife at home, probably asleep by now, not knowing where I was. I thought about how no one would find me out here if something happened. That thought hit me hard, and I felt my chest get tight. Then I saw something that made my whole body tense up. On the left side of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead, there was a figure standing in the tree line. Just standing there, perfectly still, watching us pass. It was a man, I could tell by the build, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I only saw him because my headlights caught a flash of something reflective on his jacket, maybe a zipper or a button. I did not say anything, just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and my mirrors. And then I saw another one. On the right side this time, further back, but definitely there. Another person standing among the trees, facing the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked at the woman and she was still staring forward, her face completely blank like she was waiting for something. I knew right then that I had driven into something bad, something planned, and I needed to get out of there before it was too late. I did not think, I just acted. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded on the ice, fishtailing for a second before I got it under control. The woman grabbed the dashboard and finally looked at me, and her expression was not surprise or fear. It was anger. Pure, cold anger, like I had ruined something she had been working on. She opened her mouth to say something, but I was already throwing the truck into reverse. I hit the gas and we lurched backward, the tires spinning before they caught. She grabbed for my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket, yelling at me to stop, to wait, that I was making a mistake. But her voice was different now, urgent and harsh, nothing like the helpless woman I had picked up on the roadside. I shook her off and kept reversing, my eyes darting between the mirrors, trying to stay on the road. The branches scraped against the truck like fingers trying to hold us in place. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting between the trees, getting closer. She tried to grab the steering wheel then, lunging across the center console. I shoved her back with my elbow, harder than I meant to, and she hit the passenger door with a grunt. For a second our eyes met, and I saw nothing there. No humanity, no remorse, just frustration that her trap was falling apart. I reached across her and yanked the door handle, pushing the door open with my free hand while still trying to steer with the other. The cold air rushed in, and she grabbed onto the seat, screaming at me now, calling me names I will not repeat. I gave her one more shove and she tumbled out onto the icy road, rolling into the darkness. I did not wait to see if she was okay. I pulled the door shut and kept reversing until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. The whole time I could see figures emerging from the woods in my headlights, 3 of them, maybe 4, running toward the truck. They were close, too close. But I got the truck turned around and I floored it, the engine roaring as the tires fought for traction on the ice. I did not look back. I kept my foot on the gas and my eyes locked on the narrow road ahead, praying I would not slide off into a ditch or wrap the truck around a tree. The steering wheel jerked in my hands every time I hit a patch of ice, but I held on tight and kept going. It felt like forever before I finally saw the main road up ahead, that familiar stretch of pavement that would take me home. When my tires hit solid asphalt again, I let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. My whole body was shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline still pumping through me. I drove way over the speed limit the rest of the way home, constantly checking my mirrors for headlights behind me, expecting to see that old Chevy sedan following me. But there was nothing, just empty road and darkness. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a long time with the engine running, trying to calm down enough to go inside and face my wife without scaring her to death. I did not tell her everything that night. I could not. She was half asleep when I crawled into bed, and I just held her and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. The next morning I called in sick to work and drove back out to that stretch of road in the daylight. I told myself I needed to see it again, needed to prove to myself that it really happened the way I remembered. The woman's car was gone. There was no sign anyone had ever been there. No broken glass, no tire marks in the slush, nothing. I drove slow down that side road where I had taken her, the one that led into the woods. In the daylight it looked almost peaceful, just a quiet country road with bare trees on either side. But about a mile in, I found what I was looking for. There was a clearing off to the right, hidden from the road by a wall of brush, and in that clearing I could see tire tracks. Lots of them. The ground was all torn up, like multiple vehicles had been parked there recently. I did not get out of my truck to look closer. I did not need to. I knew exactly what that place was. It was where they had been waiting for me. I went to the police that same afternoon, sat in the station for 2 hours telling my story to a deputy who looked at me like I was making it all up. He wrote everything down, asked me a few questions, and said they would look into it. That was almost 2 years ago now. I never heard back from them, not once. I called a few times in the first couple months asking if there were any updates, if they had found anything. They always said the same thing, that there was no evidence of any crime, no reports of similar incidents in the area, nothing they could do. I tried to find news stories about carjackings or robberies on rural roads in our county, anything that might connect to what happened to me. I found nothing. It was like it never happened at all. But I know what I saw. I know what those people were planning to do. Sometimes at night when I cannot sleep, I think about what would have happened if I had kept driving down that road, if I had not seen those figures in the trees, if I had trusted that woman just a little bit longer. I think about the clearing with all those tire tracks, and I wonder how many people drove into those woods and never drove out. I do not take that route home anymore. I switched to a longer way that adds 20 minutes to my commute, but it stays on well-lit roads with more traffic. My wife knows the full story now. She cried when I told her, held on to me for a long time, made me promise to find a different job. I am still working on that, but some nights when I am driving home late and I see someone on the side of the road with their hazards on, I feel this sick twist in my stomach. I want to help. That is who I am, who I was raised to be. But I keep driving every single time I keep driving, and I hate myself for it a little bit, because maybe that person really does need help. Maybe their car really did break down and they are freezing and scared and alone. But I cannot stop. I will never stop again, because I know now that there are people out there who count on your kindness. They use it like a weapon, and the only reason I am here writing this is because I got lucky. I saw them before they were ready for me, that is it. That is the only reason I made it home that night. Just luck. And that thought keeps me awake more than anything else. "17 hours into a haul across the Dalton Highway in February, you start questioning every decision that brought you to this point. My graduating class back in 2009 had gone off to college, to office jobs, to lives with central heating and weekends off. And there I was, gripping a steering wheel at 2 in the morning while the Arctic tried its best to kill me. I drove freight for Kenworth Logistics out of Fairbanks, running loads up to Prudhoe Bay during the winter season when the ice roads opened, and the money got good enough to make a man forget common sense. On this run, I was hauling drilling equipment worth more than I would make in 5 years, creeping along at 20 miles an hour, because the whiteout had turned the world into a wall of static. My rig was a Peterbilt 379 that I had named Rosemary after my grandmother, and she was the only thing between me and a frozen death in a ditch. The heater blasted on full, the wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, and somewhere behind all that white nothing, the sun would not rise for another 6 hours. I had made this run maybe 40 times over 3 winters, and I had never seen conditions this bad. The radio had been giving me trouble since I passed Coldfoot, crackling in and out like someone was playing with the dial from the other side. I kept trying to reach dispatch, kept trying to raise any of the other drivers who might be out on the road that night, but all I got was bursts of static punctuated by silence. The isolation up there was something people who have never driven those roads cannot understand. There is nothing for miles in every direction except tundra and ice and the occasional frozen creek bed. No cell service, no rest stops, no farmhouses with their lights on. Just the road, your headlights, and the howling wind that rocked your trailer like it was trying to tip you over. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, but when I checked it, the screen showed no signal, which was unusual because those things were supposed to work anywhere. I told myself the storm was interfering with the satellite, told myself it would clear up in an hour or 2. That was when I first saw the figure standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 200 feet ahead, right at the edge of where my headlights could reach. I eased off the accelerator and let Rosemary slow down on her own, not wanting to brake hard on ice that I could not see beneath the packed snow. The figure was not moving, just standing there facing the road, and as I got closer I could make out more details. A dark parka with a fur-lined hood, no visible face, hands hanging at the sides. No vehicle anywhere nearby, no snowmobile. Nothing to explain how a person could be out here in the middle of a whiteout at 2 in the morning, 60 miles from the nearest outpost with a warm building. My first thought was that someone had broken down and walked until they could not walk anymore, that I was looking at a stranded driver minutes away from freezing to death. I started to pull over, my foot hovering over the brake, already running through the procedure in my head. Get them in the cab, crank the heat, radio for help once the signal came back. But something made me hesitate. The person was not waving, not flagging me down, not doing any of the things you would expect from someone desperate for rescue. They just stood there, motionless, like a mannequin someone had planted in the snow as a sick joke. I crept past at maybe 5 miles an hour, close enough that my headlights should have lit up their face, but the hood was angled down and all I could see was shadow. My side mirror caught the figure as I passed, still motionless, still facing the road like they were waiting for something. I told myself to stop, told myself that leaving someone out here was the same as leaving them to die, but my hands would not turn the wheel. There was something wrong with the way they stood. Something unnatural about that perfect stillness in a wind that was gusting hard enough to rock my trailer. I watched the mirror as the figure shrank behind me, swallowed by the whiteout, and I felt a guilt that sat heavy in my chest. I grabbed the radio and tried again, hoping to report the sighting to someone, anyone, but all I got was that same dead static. The satellite phone still showed no signal. I was completely alone out there, and I had just driven past what might have been a dying person because something in my gut told me not to stop. I replayed the image in my head over and over. The dark parka, the fur-lined hood, the hands hanging limp at the sides, and tried to convince myself I had made the right call. About 20 minutes later, the engine temperature gauge started creeping toward the red. Rosemary had never overheated on me before, not once in 3 years, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. I pulled over to the shoulder and killed the engine, listening to the wind scream against the cab while I waited for the temperature to drop. The protocol was simple. Let it cool, check the coolant, restart, and monitor. I had done it 100 times on other rigs, though never in conditions like this. Never when stopping meant exposing myself to air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. I zipped my parka all the way up, pulled on my insulated gloves, and grabbed the flashlight from under the seat. The moment I opened the door, the cold hit me like a physical wall, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my eyes water instantly. I climbed down and walked to the front of the rig, my boots crunching on packed snow, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the swirling white. The coolant reservoir looked fine. The hoses were intact. I could not find any obvious reason for the temperature spike, which meant it was probably a sensor issue, something electrical glitching in the cold. I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed the footprints. They were on the passenger side of the truck, a single line of boot prints in the fresh snow, leading from somewhere behind me toward the trailer. My flashlight followed them along the length of the rig, and they stopped right at the back doors of the trailer, like whoever made them had walked up and then just vanished. The snow was still falling hard enough that any prints would be covered within minutes, which meant these were fresh, made sometime in the last 20 minutes, while I had been sitting in the cab waiting for the engine to cool. I stood there staring at them, my breath coming out in thick white clouds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one around. I had not heard anything, had not seen any headlights or movement. The road behind me was empty. The road ahead was empty, and the only sounds were the wind and the ticking of my cooling engine. But someone had walked up to my trailer while I sat inside, completely unaware, and then disappeared without a trace. I thought about the figure on the road, the one I had passed 20 minutes ago, and a cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled into my bones. I walked toward the back of the trailer, flashlight raised, half expecting someone to jump out at me from behind the wheels. The footprints led right up to the double doors and stopped there, but the seal on the trailer was still intact. The metal lock I had secured back in Fairbanks was exactly where I had left it, untouched and frozen solid. Whoever had walked up here had not tried to break in, had not tried to steal whatever was inside. They had just walked up, stood at the doors, and then what? I circled the trailer slowly, checking every shadow, every gap between the wheels, but there was no one. The wind howled and the snow swirled, and I was completely alone. I thought about following the footprints backward, tracing them to wherever they had come from, but the idea of walking away from my rig into that white nothing made my chest tight with fear. Instead, I hurried back to the cab, climbed inside, and locked both doors. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I tried the radio again, desperate to hear another human voice, but the static was even worse now, a harsh crackling that sounded almost like interference from another signal. The engine had cooled enough to restart, so I fired up Rosemary and pulled back onto the road, pushing the speed as high as I dared in conditions that demanded caution. Every few seconds I checked my mirrors, watching for headlights behind me, watching for movement in the white wall that surrounded the truck. Nothing, just snow and darkness and the faint glow of my own taillights reflecting off the storm. I drove for maybe 10 miles, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, before I noticed something that made me ease off the gas again. The trailer was swaying. Not the normal rocking you get from wind gusts or uneven road surface, but a rhythmic, deliberate swaying, like something inside was shifting its weight from side to side. I knew what I was hauling: drilling equipment, crates of machine parts, heavy industrial materials strapped down to pallets. None of it should be moving. None of it could move unless the straps had come loose, or unless someone was inside the trailer, pushing against the load. I watched the mirror and saw the trailer sway again, a slow pendulum motion that had no natural explanation, and I felt every hair on my arm stand up beneath my coat. I was not going to stop. That was the one thing I knew for certain. Whatever was happening back there, whoever was back there, they wanted me to pull over again. They wanted me outside the cab, exposed, vulnerable. The figure on the road had been bait, the engine trouble had been a trap, and now this swaying was another attempt to make me stop. I pushed the accelerator down and felt Rosemary surge forward, the speedometer climbing past 30, then 35, faster than anyone should drive on an ice road in a whiteout. The trailer kept swaying behind me, more violently now, like whoever was inside could feel me accelerating and was trying to throw off my balance. I gripped the wheel with both hands and kept my eyes locked on the narrow cone of visibility ahead, praying I would not hit a patch of black ice or a drift that would send me spinning off the road. The next checkpoint was Dead Horse, maybe 40 miles ahead, and if I could just make it there without stopping, I would be safe. There would be other people, other trucks, a place with lights and warmth and witnesses. I just had to keep driving and not look back. Then the banging started. It came from the roof of the cab directly above my head, a heavy, rhythmic pounding, like someone was up there slamming their fist against the metal. I jerked in my seat and nearly swerved off the road, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. The banging continued, 3 hits, then a pause, then 3 more, a pattern that was too deliberate to be anything accidental. I tried to tell myself it was ice falling from an overpass, debris from the storm, anything but what it obviously was. But there are no overpasses on the Dalton Highway. There is nothing above you but sky and snow, and the occasional raven. Someone was on top of my truck, pounding on the roof while I drove through a whiteout at 40 miles an hour, and I had no idea how they had gotten there or what they wanted. I floored the accelerator and pushed Rosemary to 50, then 55, the trailer fishtailing behind me, the banging above me getting faster and more insistent. The radio crackled suddenly, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought I heard a voice, low, distorted, impossible to understand, before it dissolved back into static. I do not know how long I drove like that, speeding through a whiteout with someone on my roof and something in my trailer, both hands welded to the wheel, eyes burning from not blinking. It could have been 20 minutes or it could have been an hour. Time stopped meaning anything. The banging would pause for long stretches and then start again, sometimes directly above me, sometimes toward the back of the cab, like whoever was up there was crawling around, testing different spots. At one point I heard a scraping sound near the passenger window, metal on metal, and I looked over just in time to see something dark flash past the glass. A hand, maybe, or a boot, gone before I could focus on it. I screamed, actually screamed out loud in the cab, and swerved hard enough that the trailer jackknifed for a terrifying second before I corrected. The road ahead was still nothing but white. The mirrors showed nothing but white, and the only proof I had that any of this was real was the pounding above me and the wild swaying behind me and the taste of copper in my mouth from biting my own tongue. Then, like a miracle, I saw lights. Faint at first, just a yellowish glow in the distance that I thought might be a hallucination, but they grew brighter as I pushed toward them. Dead Horse, the outpost. I could see the outline of buildings, the orange glow of sodium lamps cutting through the storm, the shapes of other vehicles parked in a lot. I laid on the horn and did not let go, blasting it over and over as I barreled toward the checkpoint, not caring if I woke every person within 10 miles. The banging on the roof stopped the moment the lights came into view. Just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The swaying in the trailer settled into the normal rhythm of road vibration. By the time I pulled into the lot and slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop in front of the main building, everything was quiet. I sat there for a long moment, engine running, doors locked, hands still gripping the wheel, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Workers came out of the building drawn by my horn, and I watched them approach with flashlights, their faces confused and concerned. When I finally opened the door and stumbled out into the cold, I could barely speak. I just pointed at the roof, then at the trailer, and managed to say one word: someone. They searched everything. A crew of 6 men with flashlights and crowbars went over every inch of my rig, while I sat inside the main building wrapped in a blanket, drinking coffee that I could not taste. They found scratches on the roof of the cab, long, deep gouges in the paint that had not been there when I left Fairbanks. They found a vent panel on the underside of the trailer that had been pried open, the screws stripped, and the metal bent inward like someone had forced their way through. The cargo inside was undisturbed, still strapped down exactly as I had loaded it, but there were wet boot prints on the floor of the trailer and handprints on the walls where someone had braced themselves against the swaying. No one was inside when they opened the doors. Whoever had been there was gone, vanished into the storm before the truck even came to a full stop. The police took my statement and told me that I was not the first driver to report something like this on the Dalton. There had been others over the years, trucks found abandoned with no sign of the driver, rigs that arrived at checkpoints with damage no one could explain, reports of figures standing on the road in conditions no sane person would survive. They never caught anyone. They never found any bodies. They just had stories, dozens of them, going back decades. I quit hauling ice roads after that night, turned in my notice to Kenworth the day I got back to Fairbanks, and never looked back. I drive local routes now, short hauls around the lower 48 where there are gas stations every 20 miles, and cell service never drops. The money is worse, but I sleep at night, which is more than I could say for the first 6 months after that run. I still think about it, though. I think about the figure standing on the shoulder of the road, motionless in a wind that should have knocked them flat. I think about the footprints that led to my trailer and stopped, about the banging on my roof and the hand, or whatever it was, that scraped past my window at 50 miles an hour. I think about the vent panel that had been pried open from the outside, and I wonder how long that person had been riding under my trailer before they climbed up. I wonder what would have happened if I had stopped when the trailer started swaying, if I had gotten out to check the cargo like any reasonable driver would. The police told me I did the right thing by keeping moving, that the outpost lights probably saved my life. I believe them. But some nights, when the wind picks up and the dark presses against my windows, I can still hear that rhythmic banging above my head, and I have to check the locks 3 times before I can close my eyes. Around 2 a.m. on a Thursday in February, I woke up because of the silence. That sounds weird, but anyone who has lived through a real winter knows what I mean. When you fall asleep with the heater humming and the refrigerator buzzing in the background, your brain gets used to that noise. It becomes white noise, almost like a lullaby. But when everything goes dead at once, That sudden absence of sound hits you harder than any loud bang. I sat up in bed, already feeling the cold creeping into the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and when I checked it, the screen showed 2:17 a.m. and a battery at 63%. No service bars. The power had gone out, and judging by how fast the temperature was dropping, it had been out for a while. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and just sat there for a moment, trying to decide if I should get up or wait it out until morning. I had rented this place for 2 weeks to get some writing done away from the city. It was a small house about 40 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon, tucked at the end of a gravel road with maybe 3 other properties scattered along the way. My nearest neighbor was probably half a mile down. I had turned 34 the month before and decided I needed to finally finish the novel I'd been working on for 3 years. A friend of a friend owned this cabin and let me have it cheap for the off-season. It had seemed like such a good idea when I booked it. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. But sitting there in the pitch dark with no heat and no way to call anyone, peaceful was not the word that came to mind. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it around the bedroom. Everything looked normal. My laptop on the desk, my suitcase in the corner, the window showing nothing but black and the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me. I decided to check the rest of the house, mostly to make sure no pipes had burst or anything like that. The owner had warned me that the plumbing could be finicky in extreme cold, and the last thing I needed was to deal with water damage on top of everything else. I swung my legs out of bed and immediately regretted it. The floor was freezing, even through my thick socks. I found my boots near the door and shoved my feet into them without bothering to lace them up. The flashlight on my phone cut a narrow beam through the darkness as I walked down the short hallway toward the kitchen. The house was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, a combined living room and kitchen area, and a tiny mudroom by the back door. It took me maybe 30 seconds to walk the whole thing. The fridge was silent, the stovetop cold, and when I flipped a light switch out of habit, nothing happened. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening. Outside, I could hear the wind pushing against the walls, but inside, there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the soft creak of the floorboards under my weight. That was when I decided to check the windows and doors. Not because I was scared at that point, but because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. If the power was out across the area, that meant no street lights, no porch lights, nothing. Total darkness outside, and I was a woman alone in a house I barely knew, in a place where I did not know anyone. It just made sense to double-check that everything was locked up. I started with the front door, which was secure. Then the 2 windows in the living room, both latched. The bathroom window, too small for anyone to fit through anyway, was locked. I saved the back door for last because it was in the mudroom, and the mudroom was the coldest part of the house. When I got there, I shined my light through the small window set into the door, expecting to see nothing but snow. And there was snow, a lot of it. It had been falling steadily since the evening before, but something about what I saw made me stop and look closer. The snow on the back porch had been disturbed, not like an animal had walked through it. More like someone had brushed it away from the door, clearing a path right up to the handle. I stood there staring at it for I do not know how long. My brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe the wind had done it. Maybe some snow had slid off the roof and created that pattern. But the more I looked, the less those explanations made sense. The snow had been pushed aside in a deliberate arc, almost like someone had used their arm or a sleeve to wipe it away from the door. And there were marks in the snow on the porch steps too. Not quite footprints because the snow was too powdery and had probably filled them in partially, but impressions. Depressions where someone had stepped. I felt my chest get tight, and I took a step back from the door, still holding my phone up with the flashlight pointed at the window. The lock on the door was a simple deadbolt, and I checked it twice to make sure it was engaged. It was, but that did not make me feel any better. Someone had been on that porch recently, probably within the last hour or two, based on how little snow had accumulated over the cleared area. Someone had walked up to my back door in the middle of the night during a blackout, and tried to get a clear look at the handle. I backed out of the mudroom slowly, keeping my light aimed at the door like it might suddenly burst open. My mind was racing. I thought about calling 911, but when I checked my phone again, there was still no signal. Not even one bar. The house was in a bit of a dead zone to begin with, and whatever was happening with the storm must have knocked out the nearest cell tower or something. I thought about my car parked out front. I had the keys in my purse in the bedroom. I could grab them, run outside, and drive to the nearest gas station or anywhere with people. But that would mean going outside, into the dark, into the snow, where someone might be waiting. I did not know what to do. I turned off my flashlight to save battery and just stood there in the kitchen, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The windows let in the faintest glow from the snow outside, just enough to see the outlines of furniture. I listened as hard as I could, trying to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I started to wonder if maybe I was overreacting. Maybe some drunk guy had wandered up to the wrong house and left when he realized his mistake. Maybe it was the property owner checking on the place and I just had not heard him knock. I was actually starting to calm down a little when I heard it. A soft sound from the back of the house, from the mudroom. It was not loud. It was not a bang or a crash. It was the quiet, careful sound of someone testing a door handle. A slow turn, then a pause, then another turn. Like whoever was out there was trying to see if the lock would give without making too much noise. I stopped breathing. I pressed myself against the kitchen counter and did not move. The sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. Then I shifted my weight slightly to get a better angle toward the mudroom, and the floorboard under my foot let out a loud creak. The sound from the back door stopped instantly. That was when I understood. Whoever was out there was listening. They had heard me move, and now they were waiting to figure out where I was in the house. I felt sick. This was not some random drunk or a confused neighbor. This was someone who knew I was inside and was trying to get in without alerting me. I stayed frozen against the counter, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. My legs were shaking from holding still for so long. Then I heard footsteps outside, but not retreating. They were moving along the side of the house, crunching softly through the snow. Whoever it was, they were circling the building. I tracked the sound as it moved from the back toward the front, past the living room windows. I wanted to look, to see who it was, but I was terrified that if I moved toward the window, they would see the movement and know exactly where I was standing. So I just listened as the footsteps passed by, slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time. Like someone who was not in any hurry at all. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the front of the house. I waited, straining to hear anything. A full minute passed with nothing, then 2 minutes. I was starting to think maybe they had left when I heard the front door handle rattle. Not as gently as the back door. This time it was more forceful, like they were done being subtle. The door shook in its frame but held. I had locked it, thank God, and it was a solid wooden door with a good deadbolt. But the sound of someone actively trying to force their way in while I stood helpless in the dark was something I will never forget. I made a decision then. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, feeling my way along the wall with one hand. I did not turn on my flashlight because I did not want to give away my position. In the bedroom, I grabbed my car keys from my purse and the small kitchen knife I had been using to cut apples earlier that day. It was not much, but it was something. I crouched down beside the bed, putting my back against the wall so no one could come up behind me, and I waited. The rattling at the front door stopped after maybe 30 seconds. Then silence again. I do not know how long I sat there on the floor in the dark. It could have been 20 minutes or it could have been 2 hours. Time stopped making sense. Every tiny sound made my heart jump. The house creaking, the wind gusting, even my own breathing sounded impossibly loud. At some point, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the house. I heard them crunch through the snow, getting fainter and fainter until I could not hear them at all. but I did not trust it. I kept thinking it was a trick, that whoever it was had just moved further away to wait for me to let my guard down. So I stayed exactly where I was, gripping that stupid little knife, watching the faint gray rectangle of the bedroom window for any sign of movement. The sky eventually started to lighten, just barely, that first hint of dawn turning the black into a dark blue. I had never been so grateful to see the sun coming up in my entire life. I stayed on that floor until there was enough light to see clearly, until I could look out the window and confirm that there was no one standing in the yard. When I finally got up, my whole body was stiff and aching from sitting in the same position for so long. The power was still out, but there was enough daylight now that I did not need my flashlight. I walked through the house, checking every window, every door. The front door showed scratches around the lock that had not been there before, deep gouges in the wood where someone had tried to pry it open. The back door was the same, with fresh marks around the deadbolt. I went outside through the front, staying close to the house, and walked around to check the perimeter. The snow told the whole story. There were footprints everywhere, circling the entire house multiple times, stopping at every window, clustering around both doors. Big footprints, probably a man based on the size. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could, and they led off toward the tree line behind the property and disappeared into the woods. I did not follow them. I went back inside, grabbed my stuff as fast as I could, and I was in my car and driving away within 10 minutes. I did not even lock the door behind me. I just left. I drove straight to the police station in the nearest town and told them everything. They sent someone out to the property, but by the time they got there, fresh snow had covered most of the footprints. They found the scratches on the doors and took some pictures, filed a report. The officer told me it was probably someone who knew the house was usually empty in winter and assumed no one was there. Maybe someone looking to steal whatever they could find, or just looking for a place to get out of the cold. They never caught anyone. I called the property owner and told him what happened, and he was shocked, said nothing like that had ever happened before. I did not go back to finish my 2 weeks. I did not ask for a refund. I just wanted to forget about it. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night sometimes, 3 years later. Whoever was out there, they were not just trying random doors. They cleared the snow from the handle before they tried it. They listened for my movements inside. They circled the house, checking every possible entry point, patient and methodical. And when they could not get in, they just walked away into the woods like it was nothing. I never saw a face, never heard a voice. I have no idea who it was or why they chose that house on that night, and I guess I never will. Greenleaf Copy and Print sat at the dead end of a strip mall on Route 17, one of those forgotten little shops that survived on loyalty and stubbornness more than actual foot traffic. I had been working there for about 8 months when this happened, running the front counter, helping customers with business cards and banners, occasionally taking passport photos for people who always seemed annoyed at how they turned out. My manager, Rich Oberlin, a stocky guy in his 50s who inherited the place from his father, called me around noon that Wednesday, asking if I could cover the closing shift. Stacy, the regular evening girl, had called in with some kind of throat infection that made her voice sound like gravel in a blender. At 24, still chipping away at student loans from a communications degree that had yet to prove useful, I grabbed every extra shift I could. The weather forecast mentioned snow, but nothing that sounded particularly threatening. When I pulled into the parking lot at 3 in the afternoon, the sky had that heavy, bruised look that upstate New York gets before something nasty rolls through. I should have paid more attention to that. By 5:30, what the radio called a significant winter weather event had buried the parking lot under a thick white blanket. The snow fell in dense curtains, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and the few cars that crept along Route 17 looked like ghosts drifting through fog. Rich checked in by phone, his voice cutting in and out through spotty reception, reminding me that the shop had never closed early in 18 years of operation. Small town reputation and all that. I told him I would stick it out until 9, already calculating the overtime in my head. The nail salon next door shut off its lights around 6, and I watched the owner sprint to her car with her coat pulled over her head, tires spinning briefly before she disappeared into the white. After that, I had the entire strip mall to myself. The heating system kept the front area comfortable enough, though I knew the back rooms, the storage area, and the old break room that nobody used anymore ran about 10 degrees colder. For 2 hours, I sat behind the counter with a paperback novel, listening to the wind rattle the plate glass windows and watching snowdrifts climb higher against the doors. Not a single customer, not even a phone call, just me and the hum of fluorescent lights and the storm howling outside like something hungry. Around 7:15, I decided to make myself some coffee in the break room. The shop had a small layout that I knew by heart. The front counter and customer area took up maybe a third of the space, with the big copiers and printing equipment filling the middle section. Behind that, a narrow hallway led to the storage room on the left, the break room on the right, and a back door at the very end that opened onto a small loading area behind the building. That back door had been stuck for years, painted shut according to Rich, and nobody ever bothered fixing it since we received all our deliveries through the front. I grabbed my empty mug and walked past the row of silent machines, their display screens dark and waiting. The break room was nothing special, just a mini fridge, a microwave crusted with old spaghetti stains, a wobbly table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a coffee maker that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. I flipped the light switch, and the single bulb flickered twice before catching. The room felt colder than usual, which I blamed on the storm, and the fact that the heating vents back here had never worked properly. While the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter and scrolled through my phone, half reading a news article about the storm causing accidents on the interstate. The smell of cheap coffee filled the small room, mixing with that particular mustiness that old buildings develop over decades. That was when I heard it for the first time. A soft thump from somewhere deeper in the building, coming from the direction of the storage room. I stopped scrolling and listened, holding my breath without really meaning to. Nothing, just the coffee maker gurgling through its final cycle and the muffled roar of wind outside. I told myself it was probably something falling off a shelf, maybe a stack of paper boxes that had been piled too high. The storage room was packed with years of accumulated inventory that Rich never bothered to organize. I poured my coffee, added 2 packets of sugar, and headed back to the front counter. The hallway seemed darker than before, though I knew that was just my imagination playing tricks. When I passed the storage room door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches of black space visible between the door and the frame. I could have sworn it had been closed when I walked by earlier. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and pulled it shut until I heard the latch click. Old buildings shift and settle, especially in extreme cold. Doors drift open sometimes. I repeated that to myself as I walked back to the front, gripping my warm mug a little tighter than necessary. The next hour passed without incident, and I started to relax again. I finished a chapter of my book, checked the weather radar on my phone, and watched the snow continue to pile up outside. The drifts against the front door had reached nearly 2 feet, and I started to worry about whether my old Subaru would even make it out of the parking lot when closing time came. Around 8:20, I got up to stretch my legs and decided to walk the perimeter of the shop, partly out of boredom, and partly because something at the back of my mind kept nagging at me about that storage room door. The front area looked exactly as it should. The counter clean, the display racks undisturbed, the windows showing nothing but swirling white. I moved past the copiers and printers, running my hand along their smooth surfaces, listening to the building creak and groan under the weight of accumulating snow. When I reached the hallway, I stopped. The storage room door was open again, not just slightly ajar this time, but wide open, revealing the darkness inside like a mouth waiting to swallow something. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, staring into that black rectangle. The storage room had no windows, no source of natural light, and the single bulb inside was controlled by a pull chain that hung from the ceiling about 6 feet in. I could see the vague outlines of shelving units and stacked boxes, but nothing moved, Nothing made a sound. My heart had started beating faster, and I became very aware of how alone I was, how far from any other person. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Maybe the latch was broken. Maybe the door frame was warped from age and temperature changes. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam into the storage room. Boxes of printer paper, toner cartridges, old promotional signs that Rich refused to throw away, rolls of vinyl for the banner printer. Everything looked undisturbed, coated in a thin layer of dust that sparkled in the light. I took 2 steps inside, reaching up for the pull chain, and that was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dust on the concrete floor, but they were definitely there. A trail of shoe prints leading from the back corner of the room toward the door where I now stood. Someone had walked through here recently. Someone wearing what looked like work boots, size 10 or 11 from the shape of them. And the prints only went one direction, toward the front of the store, which meant whoever made them was still inside the building. My first instinct was to run straight for the front door and get out, but something stopped me. The snow outside had to be 3 feet deep by now, and my car was parked at least 50 yards away. If someone was in here with me, and if that someone meant harm, I would be wading through knee-deep snow in the dark while they watched from the warm interior. I backed out of the storage room slowly, keeping my phone light aimed ahead of me, trying to control my breathing. The break room door was closed exactly as I had left it earlier. The back door at the end of the hallway, the one Rich said was painted shut, looked the same as always. But when I walked closer, holding my breath, I noticed something that made my legs feel weak. The door frame near the latch had fresh scratches in the paint, bright white marks against the dull cream color, and the door itself sat slightly crooked in the frame. Someone had forced it open from the outside. The snow on the small concrete pad behind the building would have covered any tracks within minutes, which meant this person could have entered hours ago, long before the storm got bad enough to trap us both inside. I retreated to the front counter as quietly as I could manage, my sneakers barely making a sound on the thin commercial carpet. My mind raced through the layout of the shop, trying to figure out where someone could hide. The storage room seemed clear, at least the main area. The break room was too small to conceal anyone for long, but there was another space I had forgotten about, a narrow utility closet built into the wall between the copier area and the hallway, where Rich kept cleaning supplies and a few old machines that no longer worked. The door to that closet blended almost seamlessly with the wall paneling, easy to miss if you did not know it was there. I'd only opened it twice in 8 months, once to grab a mop when a customer spilled coffee, and once when Rich asked me to find a specific replacement part for one of the printers. I stared at that section of wall from behind the counter, my phone clutched in one hand, trying to remember if I had noticed anything unusual when I walked past earlier. The closet door had a small brass handle, tarnished almost black with age, and from this distance I could not tell if it was fully closed or slightly open. I did not want to find out. I needed to call for help, but when I looked at my phone, the signal had dropped to a single flickering bar. The storm must have been interfering with the cell towers, or maybe the snow was just too thick for anything to get through. I tried calling 911 anyway, pressing the phone hard against my ear, but all I got was static and silence, not even a ring. My second thought was the landline on the counter, an old beige phone that Rich kept for backup and rarely used. I picked up the receiver and heard nothing, just dead air. The phone lines must have gone down with the storm, buried under ice and snow somewhere between here and town. I was completely cut off, alone in a building with someone who had broken in and hidden themselves for hours, watching me go about my evening without any idea they were there. The thought of it made my skin prickle with something between fear and revulsion. I pictured myself making coffee, reading my book, checking my phone, all while a stranger lurked somewhere in the shadows, studying my movements, waiting for something. Waiting for what exactly? That question terrified me more than anything else because I had no way of knowing the answer. A sound broke the silence, and this time it was unmistakable. Not a thump or a creak, but a slow, deliberate footstep coming from the hallway. Then another. Someone was walking toward the front of the store, not even trying to be quiet anymore. I ducked behind the counter, pressing my back against the wooden panel, and grabbed the only thing within reach that could serve as a weapon, a heavy-duty paper cutter with a long metal blade. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the copiers, maybe 20 feet from where I crouched. I could hear breathing now, slow and even, the sound of someone completely calm. My own breath came in shallow gasps that I tried desperately to muffle with my hand. Through a small gap between the counter and the wall, I could see a sliver of the shop floor, just enough to catch movement if anyone walked past. For a long moment, nothing happened. The breathing continued, steady as a metronome, and I realized with horrible clarity that this person knew exactly where I was. They had probably watched me duck behind the counter. They were standing there in the middle of my workplace, in no hurry at all, enjoying the fact that I was trapped and terrified and completely at their mercy. Then headlights swept across the front windows, bright and sudden, cutting through the snow like a miracle. A truck had pulled into the parking lot, its engine rumbling loud enough to penetrate the glass. I heard the footsteps behind me move quickly, retreating back toward the hallway, no longer slow or deliberate, but fast and urgent. Without thinking, I stood up and screamed, waving my arms at the truck outside. Not even words really, just raw noise coming out of my throat. The truck stopped about 30 feet from the door, and I saw a figure climb out, bundled in a heavy coat, wading through the snow toward the entrance. Behind me, I heard the back door slam, the one that was supposed to be painted shut, and then nothing. I ran to the front door and shoved it open against the snowdrift, cold air hitting my face like a slap, and nearly tackled the man coming toward me. His name was Earl, I learned later, a driver for a tow company who had been looking for a place to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing on to a call. He said I looked like I had seen death itself, pale and shaking and barely able to form sentences. I told him someone had been inside with me, that they had broken in through the back, and he helped me search the building while keeping his own tire iron ready. We found the utility closet door standing wide open, and inside, shoved behind a broken laminator, there was a backpack that did not belong to anyone at the shop. Earl pulled it out carefully, using his gloved hands, and we looked inside together. A change of clothes, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade, a roll of duct tape, a small flashlight, and a burner phone with no contact saved. There was also a folded piece of paper with the shop's hours written on it, along with a note in messy handwriting that said, "Wed night, one girl alone." Earl called the police from his truck radio, and they arrived about an hour later after the plows had cleared enough of Route 17 to get through. The officers took the backpack as evidence and told me I was lucky, though they used a different word that I will not repeat here. They found boot prints in the snow behind the building, leading toward the woods about a quarter-mile away, but the storm had filled them in before they could follow the trail. They never caught whoever it was. I quit the job 2 days later and moved back to my parents' house in Connecticut for a few months until I could stop jumping at every unexpected sound. Sometimes I still think about that note, about how someone had been watching the shop long enough to know the schedule, to know that Wednesday nights meant one employee working alone until 9. I think about the hours I spent reading my book and drinking coffee, while a stranger with a knife and duct tape waited in the dark, 10 feet away from me, breathing slowly and watching through the crack in a closet door. And I wonder what would have happened if Earl had decided to wait out the storm somewhere else. Living alone had never bothered me before that winter. At the time, my name was Clara, and I had rented a remote house miles away from the nearest town to save money and clear my head. Work was remote, life was quiet, and isolation felt like a luxury instead of a threat. Snowstorms were common in that region, and I had stocked up the way everyone told me to. The forecast mentioned heavy snow, nothing unusual, and I remember feeling almost excited for the forced stillness. That morning, the world outside was already muted, wrapped in thick white silence. Wind dragged loose snow across the yard like smoke. Inside, the house creaked the way old places do when temperatures drop. By late afternoon, the storm had grown teeth. Snow piled against the doors faster than I could shovel, and the road disappeared completely. Phone signal flickered in and out, and the power died without warning, plunging every room into an early dusk. The heater shut down, leaving only the faint tick of cooling pipes. Candles became my new light sources, their flames bending whenever the wind slammed the siding. I kept telling myself this was normal, just a rough storm passing through. Still, the silence between gusts felt too deep, like the house was holding its breath. Every sound carried weight in a way it never had before. The first impact came just after dark. A dull thud against the outer wall, low and heavy, followed by another closer to the back of the house. Ice chunks falling from the roof made sense, and so did wind-driven debris, so that's what I told myself. The noises repeated, irregular but deliberate enough to pull my attention every time. Each hit seemed to test a different section of the house. I paced from room to room listening, trying to map where the sounds came from. The storm howled loudly enough to blur everything together, yet those impacts stood out, sharper somehow. I avoided the windows, uneasy about what I might see beyond the glass. Eventually, curiosity won. One candle in hand, I approached the living room window, wiping condensation from the inside with my sleeve. Snow covered most of the glass, pressed high and thick, but something darker caught my eye. A shape stood out where the snow thinned, uneven and unsettlingly familiar. The impression looked like fingers splayed wide, pressed flat against the outside of the window. Before I could fully process it, the mark vanished as snow slid back into place. Moments later, another impact struck the opposite side of the house. That's when the realization set in that whatever was out there wasn't random, and it wasn't staying in one place. Night pressed in hard after that. Candles burned lower, and the cold crept across the floors in slow, numb waves. The impacts kept coming, spaced out just enough to prevent any rhythm, like whoever or whatever was outside didn't want me getting used to it. Wind alone couldn't explain how the sounds shifted from wall to wall. At one point, the noise came from right beside the front door, close enough that I could hear snow sliding down afterward. I stood in the hallway listening, counting breaths without realizing I was doing it. The house felt smaller with every passing minute. Even the ceiling seemed closer, as if the storm were pressing everything inward. Another window showed signs not long after. Frost scraped away from the outside in a rough oval, followed by a second hand-shaped mark beside it. The fingers were long, uneven, and left clear grooves in the snow, deep enough to show pressure. They didn't linger, never staying long enough for me to study them properly. Each time I tried to get closer, the marks faded, replaced by fresh snowfall as if nothing had been there. The storm worked like a curtain, hiding movements between gusts. Whoever was circling the house knew that. The idea settled in slowly and refused to leave. The banging changed tone after that, growing more controlled, less chaotic. One strike landed near the kitchen, followed by another near the bedroom, spaced as if someone were walking the perimeter. My phone finally lost signal completely, leaving me with a dead screen and no outside connection. The temperature inside dropped fast enough that I could see my breath. Layers of clothing barely helped, and my focus narrowed to staying warm and alert. Footprints never appeared in the yard, but the snow kept shifting near the foundation. Something out there was close enough to disturb it, yet hidden well enough to stay unseen. Eventually, exhaustion forced a decision. The safest room was the pantry, small and buried toward the center of the house. Blankets, canned food, and one remaining candle came with me as I shut the door. The impacts continued for hours, sometimes closer, sometimes distant, until the storm's roar swallowed them entirely. At some point, the sounds stopped altogether, leaving only wind and settling ice. Morning light filtered faintly through the cracks when the blizzard finally eased. No marks remained outside, no damage, no tracks, just untouched snow. Roads reopened days later, and I left as soon as possible, never returning, still unsure who had been waiting for the storm to trap me inside. Morning didn't arrive the way it usually does. There was no clean sunrise, just a gradual thinning of darkness as the storm loosened its grip. I stayed in the pantry longer than necessary, listening for anything that didn't belong. When I finally opened the door, the house felt wrong in a different way. Too quiet, like a space after a loud argument. The air inside was bitterly cold, and every step sent sharp cracks through the floorboards. I moved room to room slowly, candle held out in front of me, checking windows, doors, corners. Everything looked intact. No broken glass, no forced entry. That somehow made it worse. Outside light revealed more than I wanted. Snow had piled almost to the windows, smooth and undisturbed except in a few places where it looked handled. Near the living room window, the surface wasn't wind-shaped. It was flattened in patches, uneven, like someone had leaned there and then stepped back. The impressions were faint but intentional, pressed deeper than drifting snow would allow. I scanned the yard as far as I could see through the remaining haze, half expecting movement. Nothing stirred. No tracks led away, no signs of departure. The storm had erased everything except those subtle disruptions near the house itself. I forced the front door open with effort, snow resisting like it wanted me to stay inside. Cold air rushed in, sharp and metallic, carrying that empty post-storm stillness. I stood there for a long moment, listening again, exposed and shaking for reasons beyond the temperature. The walls that had felt like protection hours earlier now seemed thin and unreliable. Whatever had been outside had chosen not to come in, and that choice bothered me more than if it had tried. The thought that someone had tested the house and decided against entering stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. Once the roads were cleared later that day, I packed what I could and left before night had a chance to settle again. I didn't wait for explanations or reassurance from anyone else. The house returned to being just a structure in the snow, silent and empty. Even now, years later, I replay that day in fragments. The timing of the impacts, the way the marks appeared and vanished, the precision of it all. I still don't know who was outside or why the storm mattered so much to them. I only know that something used the weather as cover, and I was never meant to see it clearly. Winter mornings near my place were usually quiet enough that I could hear my own boots compressing the snow. At that point in my life, I was living alone in a small rental on the edge of town, working irregular hours and using long walks to clear my head. The trail behind my neighborhood wasn't anything official, just a worn path locals used to cut through the trees. That day, the air had that sharp, dry cold that makes your nose sting with every breath. I remember debating whether to go out at all because the ground was slick and the sky looked heavy. Still, I needed the movement, the routine, something normal. I zipped my coat up to my chin and headed toward the tree line, expecting nothing more than silence and frozen branches. About 15 minutes in, I noticed someone ahead of me on the trail. That alone wasn't strange, but the way they were dressed caught my attention immediately. No gloves, no hat, and a thin jacket that looked more like something you'd wear in early fall. Their steps were slow and uneven, almost dragging, leaving shallow marks in the snow. Every few seconds they paused, as if listening for something behind them. I slowed my pace without fully realizing why, keeping a steady distance. The woods around us were dense, darker than usual, the kind that swallows sound. I remember thinking how exposed that person must be to the cold. Yet they didn't seem bothered. The path split near a fallen tree, with the main trail curving back toward the neighborhood. Instead of following it, the person ahead veered toward an area marked with old warning signs nailed to trunks. Most locals avoided that section because it bordered protected land, and the terrain dropped off sharply. The person didn't hesitate, stepping over the thin rope barrier like it wasn't there. I stopped completely, my breath fogging the air, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to call out, maybe warn them, but my voice wouldn't come. The quiet felt heavier than before, like the forest was holding it in. After a long moment, I turned back, uneasy and annoyed at myself for letting a stranger rattle me. Weeks passed and the memory faded into something I only thought about when I walked that way again. Then one evening, flashing lights lit up the road near my place, painting the snow in red and blue. Law enforcement vehicles were parked along the trail entrance and officers were moving in and out of the trees. Later, word spread that they were searching the restricted area because of an unrelated investigation. Nobody mentioned a person on the trail or anything unusual found that day. Still, standing at my window, watching the lights flicker against the forest, that image of the underdressed figure came rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. It felt like a piece of something larger I had brushed against and never understood. The following days changed how I moved through that part of town. The trail stayed open, but the casual rhythm it once had was gone. I found myself scanning the tree line more than the ground, noticing things I'd ignored for years. Broken branches piled in odd places, faint tracks that didn't match boots or animals, scraps of fabric snagged on thorns. I kept replaying the way that person had crossed into the restricted area so calmly, like they'd done it before. There was no sense of urgency in their movements, no rush to get somewhere warm. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Cold like that usually forces decisions, but they had moved with patience, almost intention. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to ask around. At a small local diner, I overheard two older men talking about the police activity. They spoke in hushed tones, mentioning thefts, illegal dumping, and something about makeshift shelters deep in the woods. One of them joked about people hiding where nobody wanted to look. I sat there stirring my coffee long after it went cold, realizing how close that hidden area was to my daily routine. I thought about how easily I'd followed the stranger's path with my eyes, how natural it felt to watch them drift away from safety. It unsettled me to admit how close I'd come to stepping past those signs myself. Sleep didn't come easily for a while after that. Every creak outside my window sounded amplified. Every gust of wind felt deliberate. I started locking my doors earlier than usual and stopped using the trail altogether. Once, during another walk closer to town, I spotted a piece of rope half buried in snow that looked identical to the barrier near the restricted area. I couldn't say for sure it was the same, but seeing it there sent a jolt through me. It made me wonder how many markers I'd missed before, how many times I'd crossed paths with things just outside my awareness. The idea that danger didn't announce itself weighed heavily on me. Eventually, the police presence disappeared, and life resumed its usual pace. No official statements reached us beyond vague reassurances. Still, that winter walk stayed with me, reshaping how I thought about familiar places. I learned that proximity doesn't equal safety, and routine can blind you to quiet warnings. Even now, years later, I avoid wooded shortcuts during colder months. I don't know who that person was or why they were there, and maybe I never will. What I do know is that noticing them changed something permanent in me, a subtle shift toward caution that hasn't faded with time. Spring eventually softened the edges of that winter, but it didn't erase what had happened. I remember the first time the snow fully melted and the ground turned to mud, exposing things that had been hidden for months. From the road, I could see where the forest floor had been disturbed in the restricted area, darker patches where people had clearly been moving back and forth. It made the whole thing feel more real, less like a strange memory, and more like a near miss. I realized how thin the line was between a normal habit and a dangerous situation. All it took was one step off a familiar path. Not long after that, a short article appeared on a local news site. It talked about arrests connected to illegal activity tied to the forest, mentioning stolen property and individuals using the area to stay out of sight. The report was vague and careful, probably to avoid panic, but it confirmed enough to make my chest tighten. They included a photo taken from the edge of the woods, showing debris and a narrow footpath that looked exactly like the one I'd seen that day. I stared at that image for a long time, tracing the route with my finger. It finally clicked that the person I'd followed with my eyes hadn't been lost or careless. They'd known exactly where they were going. That realization brought an unexpected mix of relief and dread. Relief that I hadn't called out, hadn't followed, hadn't tried to be helpful. Dread because it meant I'd unknowingly been close to something deliberate and hidden. I started sharing the story quietly with a few friends, framing it as a strange coincidence rather than anything dramatic. Most of them brushed it off, saying things like that happen everywhere. But a couple went quiet, especially those who also used trails near their homes. It was unsettling to see that same shift of awareness pass to them, the same pause before they spoke. In the end, the solution was simple and practical. I stopped using that trail altogether and adjusted my routines. I found busier routes, places with open sightlines and people around. The forest is still there, unchanged, and I still pass it sometimes on my way to work, but I don't feel drawn to it anymore. That single winter walk taught me that familiarity can be misleading, and not every quiet place is empty. I don't know what would have happened if I'd taken a few more steps forward that day. What matters is that I didn't, and that choice still feels like the right one. Working remotely during a harsh winter had become my routine by then, especially with deadlines piling up and the days getting shorter. At that point in my life, I was living alone in a small 2-story house, trying to save money and keep my head down. Snow had been falling on and off for days, the kind that muffles everything outside and makes the house feel sealed off from the world. That evening, my job kept me glued to my desk, headset on, juggling calls and reports while the heater hummed nonstop. I remember feeling oddly grateful for the isolation, like the storm had given me an excuse to disappear for a while. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful, but I brushed that thought aside. I told myself it was just winter doing what winter does, pressing in from all sides. Nothing about that night seemed special yet, just another long shift at home. The first sound slipped past my headphones like a mistake, something soft and brief that didn't belong to the audio in my ears. I paused the call, lifted one side of the headset, and listened, expecting the heater or the pipes. What I heard instead was closer, like a faint scrape, the kind you'd get from fabric brushing a wall. I stood up and checked the hallway, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. Every door on the ground floor was closed, lights off, shadows sitting where they should. Back at my desk, I chalked it up to fatigue and put the headset on again. Minutes later, another noise came through, heavier this time, like a slow step being placed carefully. My focus started slipping, but I forced myself to finish the task in front of me. I didn't want to admit how alert I'd become to every tiny sound. As the night dragged on, those subtle noises kept returning, always just quiet enough to make me question whether they were real. Sometimes it sounded like a door shifting slightly, sometimes like something brushing past furniture. Each time I checked, the house looked normal, almost staged in its stillness. Near the end of my shift, I got up to refill my mug and noticed the door to the guest room standing open. I clearly remembered closing it earlier because the draft from the window made it rattle. The bathroom door down the hall was open too, angled in a way I never leave it. Standing there, mug forgotten in my hand, I felt a creeping sense of unease settle in my chest. I walked through the house, closing each door again, paying attention to the sound of the latches clicking. When I returned to my desk, the silence felt louder than before. Sleep didn't come easily after I logged off, and the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. The next morning, still bothered, I checked the security camera app on my phone, more out of curiosity than fear. The footage from the previous night showed subtle movement during my working hours, shadows shifting and doors changing position on their own. At one point, the guest room door eased open slowly, like someone careful was controlling it. There was no clear figure, no obvious person, just motion where there shouldn't have been any. I replayed the clips again and again, scanning for an entry point, a window, anything that made sense. Every lock had remained secured the entire time, according to the system. Sitting there with my phone in my hand, I realized those sounds hadn't been my imagination at all. I spent the rest of that morning walking through the house with a notepad, writing down what the cameras had actually captured. Each clip showed the same rooms I had checked in person, yet the timing didn't line up with my memory. The hallway light flicked on briefly at one point, even though I hadn't touched the switch all night. In another clip, the door to the storage closet shifted inward, stopped, then slowly returned to its original position. No sudden movements, no rush, just patience. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Whatever caused it wasn't careless or accidental. It behaved like it knew the house, like it understood how little force was needed to avoid making noise. Later that day, I called a friend named Lucas to come over, mostly because I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. We went over the footage together on my laptop, frame by frame, pausing and rewinding until my eyes hurt. Lucas tried to joke at first, suggesting drafts or pressure changes from the cold, but his tone changed as the clips kept playing. He pointed out how consistent the movement was, always during my work hours, always stopping when I stood up from my desk. We checked every window, every vent, even the attic access, finding nothing disturbed. The snow outside was untouched except for my own footprints from earlier that morning. Seeing his confidence fade made the situation feel heavier, more real. That night I worked again, though I didn't put my headphones on this time. Every sound felt amplified without them, from the heater cycling to the faint tick of the walls contracting. I positioned my desk so I could see the hallway clearly, keeping the doors in view. Hours passed without incident, and part of me started hoping the previous night had been a one-time thing. Near the end of my shift, a soft click echoed through the house, unmistakable and deliberate. The bathroom door, which I had locked, eased open by a few inches and stopped. I didn't move, barely breathing, watching it like staring at an animal that might bolt if startled. After a long minute, it closed again, gently, leaving the latch exactly where it had been. The next day, I contacted a security technician to review the system in person. He confirmed there were no glitches, no remote access, and no signs of tampering. Before leaving, he suggested adding motion sensors inside the house, something I agreed to immediately. After they were installed, the unexplained activity stopped completely. No more sounds, no doors shifting, no movement on camera. Even so, I didn't relax. I moved my workspace into the living room and kept interior doors open from then on. To this day, I still don't know what caused those hours of quiet movement while I worked. All I know is that whatever it was seemed aware of me, and once it realized I was watching back, it never returned. That week ended with a strange kind of quiet settling into the house, the kind that doesn't feel earned. Work returned to normal. Deadlines came and went, and the cameras showed nothing but empty rooms and steady timestamps. Even so, habits had changed without me really choosing them. Lights stayed on longer than necessary, and I caught myself listening before stepping into any room. The motion sensors never triggered, not once, which should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a held breath that never fully released. Friends told me I was overthinking it, that stress and isolation can mess with perception. Deep down, I knew stress hadn't opened locked doors or shifted shadows on a screen. Normalcy had come back too cleanly. Winter dragged on, and the snow eventually melted, exposing the yard exactly as it should be. No disturbed soil, no marks along the siding, nothing to point at and say, "That's it, that's the reason." I reviewed the footage one last time before archiving it, forcing myself to watch without jumping ahead. There was a pattern to it, subtle but consistent, always centered around the same hallway and the same interior doors. Never the front door, never the back. It felt less like an intrusion and more like a presence navigating familiar territory. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Houses, after all, remember things better than people do. Eventually, a practical decision replaced speculation. The house went up for sale, and I told myself the move was about space and convenience. Packing up felt like closing a chapter that refused to explain itself. On the final day there, every door stood open, sunlight reaching into corners that had stayed dark before. Walking through those empty rooms, the place looked harmless, almost ordinary. No sounds followed me, no last gesture, no sign of whatever had shared those hours with me. The cameras came down, one by one, and I left them behind with the keys on the counter. The silence didn't follow me out. Now, living somewhere else, working similar hours, winter doesn't carry the same weight it used to. Headphones still come off now and then, just to check the space around me, a habit I doubt will fade. Nothing like that has happened again, and maybe that's the closest thing to an answer I'll get. Some things don't need a name or a face to leave a mark. All I know is that during those hours, something moved through my home without ever showing itself. When I stopped pretending it wasn't happening, it stopped happening too. That's the part I still think about late at night.